How did she give credibility to a nonsensical falsehood?
For example, going on Iranian TV and lauding a force called the Popular Mobilization Force. I think it is.
Okay, do you know anything about them? Do you know anything about them?
It's an Islamic fundamentalist organization.
Okay. Have you done anything more than actually look at their Wikipedia page?
I'm sure you're going to tell me stuff, so go ahead.
This is Here's How, Ireland's political, social and current affairs podcast, presented by William Campbell.
Thank you for downloading episode 136 for the 9th of June 2022. We really got into it in this interview, not least because I was offering plenty of my own opinions, so I won't do an editorial here. There's plenty of my voice in the podcast already. I'll just say thanks to all of the patrons on Patreon, especially to Graham Quinn and to Tom, who signed up as patrons since the last podcast, and to Peter, who made a generous contribution to the podcast. I really appreciate everyone who chips in. We don't get any huge money out of it, not nearly in the same league as some other Irish podcasters that I could mention, but it pays for things like web hosting, and Kevin and myself basically donate our time for free. And it's also a great morale booster when we get a new patron on Patreon. It lets us know that there are people out there who listen and appreciate the podcast. We make a big effort to cover things that are undercovered in Irish media. You are more than welcome to listen for free, but if you think you could do the same as Tom and Graham and Peter and the other donors and throw in the price of a cup of coffee once or twice a month, there's details of how to do that on the website and at the end of the show. On the line now, I have Frank Armstrong. Frank is the editor of the magazine called Cassandra Voices. Frank, what's your or the magazine's political stance, briefly?
Well, the magazine doesn't have a political orientation. It's a platform for independent voices to inspire new thinking, which is our elevator pitch. Mm-hmm. And personally, I suppose I would have come from more of a left background politically, but I found during the pandemic that my views did not align with many on the left, and I see perhaps I would be less. I might be difficult to pin down ideologically. I certainly think that we need to do a lot to change our current economic system, mm-hmm. make it a lot fairer. But I also see a space and to prevent the environmental destruction that's ongoing. But I also see a space for entrepreneurship and small business people, and would be very wary of a kind of corporate takeover of a society, an ongoing corporate takeover of our society.
Okay, that's a reasonable way to express that stance. You and I had a bit of a clash on Twitter, and I thought it would be better to move the debate onto a podcast where maybe we can get a little more light and a little less heat. But it started off from this, and people may be aware of this, particularly if they read the Irish Times or follow some Irish Times journalists on Twitter. And this happened.
Any comment on the Popular Mobilization Forces accused by Human Rights Watch of persecuting LGBT people, please, Daly? Miss Daly, you appeared in a promotional video saying that they were inclusive and you praised them.
That in the background there, that's the Naomi O'Leary of the Irish Times. I think it's called doorstepping, but she's chasing Claire Daly through the corridors of the European Parliament. Claire Daly is fairly well known in Irish journalistic rings for really not responding to journalistic either questions or requests for interviews almost at all. She very rarely cooperates with that. I commented on that. You disagreed with me. Tell me the kind of the basis of your disagreement, Frank.
Well, firstly, Twitter doesn't exactly bring out the best of our personalities.
It sure doesn't.
Allowing for that, the point I was making was that actually I had heard Claire Daly on RTE a number of times, and to say she was not engaging with the Irish public is incorrect. Mm-hmm.
I didn't say it at all, but but journalists will know, and there are some people who have, some politicians who will answer the phone at 11 o'clock at night or 6 o'clock in the morning for journalists. Claire Daly does not have any published phone number that anybody answers ever. the numbers on her website and the numbers on the European Parliament website for her are never answered. She has DMs closed on Twitter. I've sent her a long series of emails and she's never either answered or acknowledged them. And I'm aware that that's the case for many journalists working in Ireland.
Okay, well, I've had the experience on a number of occasions of contacting politicians and not hearing back from them. I don't think it's essential for a politician to get back to every member of the public or every journalist that is contacted by them. I think she engages with the mainstream Irish media through RTE. She gives interviews. She spoke very eloquently. I didn't hear it, but read the content of her speech at the Roger Casement Summer School. To say she's not engaging with the public is, I think, incorrect and unfair on her. I think the way Naomi O'Leary has targeted her.
Frank, to be clear, I didn't say she what I said was she doesn't engage with that. She particularly uses things like speeches where she doesn't take questions and her own podcast that she does with Mick Wallace, which is very much a one-way communication which shields her from answering questions.
Well, I think there's a problem in terms of Irish political discourse more generally in that politicians aren't challenged. Mm-hmm. We've seen that through RTE not allowing politicians to square off against one another, and often you'll hear an RTE journalist actually interrogating an opposition politician as opposed to the opposition politician being allowed to interrogate the government. Which is normal way for things to operate. But things operate very strangely in our national broadcaster, I find.
I totally agree with you. And actually, long-time followers of this podcast will know there's no love lost between me and officialdom in RTE, although I know that doesn't apply to all of the actual individuals there. But I have to defend RTE a little bit because they will find, and this happens very, very regularly, particularly with government ministers, they will explicitly say that they won't come on air if the opposition politician is allowed to question them. They will answer journalist questions, but not opposition politicians' questions. So I'm not sure that's 100% the fault of RTE. I think if we had greater media diversity...
I'm aware of that. Yeah. But I'm aware of that. And I know that it's been going on for some time. But that doesn't make it right. And RTE should refuse to accede to the demands of those politicians.
Yeah, I agree completely. I think you're totally right.
The public has a right to listen to politicians being interrogated, not by RTE journalists who are, in a sense, compromised by drawing a salary from the state. There's a structural bias. I'd say it's not the case in every scenario, but there is a structural bias. And as a result, it would be much more helpful and much more democratic if opposition politicians were allowed to interrogate government politicians on air, live on air.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I'm dealing from personal experience here, but I've also spoken to people who've attempted to interrogate, in particular, Claire Daly and Mick Wallace. And they basically get an absolute brick wall. And this is not the same as other journalists. There is a clear difference between what Daly and Wallace are doing and what most other journalists and most other politicians do, including ministers who frequently say, not coming on unless I'm talking to only an interviewer, I'm not going to engage in a debate. And that is exacerbated. And I think that clear difference really comes into its own when you see that on RT, now I think they're not bothering to broadcast in English anymore because they're not allowed into English-speaking markets. RT, the Kremlin-funded Russian propaganda channel, where Claire Daly has appeared many, many times. Also CCTV, a Communist Party-run English-language Chinese television station, entirely run and owned by the Chinese Communist Party, and also Press TV, which is owned by the Iranian government. You have to admit, it is absolutely startling when Russian, Chinese and Iranian, I will use the word generously, journalists have better access to Irish politicians than Irish journalists.
I've heard Claire Daly multiple times on RT. I'm quite satisfied. I wouldn't be interested in what Naomi O'Leary would have to say to Claire Daly because it's clear she's targeting her and trying to diminish her rather than actually engage with her.
Why is that clear? Why is that clear?
It's a hit job. It's a
hit job.
Clearly a hit job.
No, why is that clear?
Well, did you read what she wrote about her? I mean, there was no. I mean, her accusation is that Claire Daly appears on Chinese government media.
No, that's not her accusation. No, it's not.
She's not alleging any corruption. She's simply stating that this in itself makes her unworthy or something. I mean,
okay. Like, roll back there.
Engage with Chinese state media.
Okay, no, this is not Chinese.
I don't care who you engage with. I've written to the Sunday Times. That doesn't mean I approve of Rupert Murdoch or anything he does.
Hold on a second. Frank, hold on a second. So first of all, I think you are misrepresenting. Naomi Leary can speak for herself, but I think you're misrepresenting what she said. Naomi Leary made the point that Claire Daly is a frequent feature on the propaganda channels of various autocratic governments. And she quoted and laid bare what Claire Daly was saying on those propaganda channels. And I think when you see that, Claire Daly's words speak for herself. I don't think, and you say that...
What did she say? Sorry, what did she say, William, that it was so reprehensible? Did she give away military secrets or something? I mean, what's wrong with having a diverse range of views and if she's and articulating them on a news information site that you don't approve of necessarily? I don't approve of huge swathes of Western media. I think they've been taken over by corporate interests and have been since the 1970s. Sure. That doesn't mean I wouldn't appear on them.
Yeah, I'll get to that in a minute. I'm going to move the debate on to that in a little minute, but just pause on that. And you've said you've written for Murdoch Papers, for example, and I'm absolutely no fan either of the papers or their owners. But I would absolutely have to acknowledge that there is a huge gulf of difference between someone like Rupert Murdoch and his papers and an outfit like RT, which is paid for directly by the Kremlin. The salaries of the people working on that station come out of the same pocket as paid for the hitman to murder Nemtsov in the center of Moscow, a critic of Putin.
I don't need you to catalogue the litany of Russian crimes that have been committed over the last number of decades. I'm familiar with them.
There have been many paid for out of the same pocket.
I've written articles against Vladimir Putin. I wrote one for about 7 or 8 years ago for Village magazine.
Yeah,
it's about actually having a proper informed debate. Claire Daly has opinions that most of which I think are quite correct, and I agree with. And I think her voice should be this harassment that has occurred of her, this idea that she cannot possibly hold this view, and a view that actually.
Frank, before you go on, what's the harassment?
Which is the neutrality is the better way forward, and that we should attempt to bring a peace settlement between Russia and Ukraine.
Okay, first of all, just Frank, specifically, what is the harassment?
Well, the harassment is the very kind of article that Naomi O'Leary in the Irish Times is writing.
Hold on for a second. Naomi O'Leary writing an article constitutes harassment.
Can I finish, William, please?
But no, are you saying that Naomi O'Leary... Yes, but I just want you to be clear. Are you saying that Naomi O'Leary writing an article that you may or may not disagree with constitutes harassment?
Well, sorry, I'm not going to get into a kind of definition of harassment, and that's not, it's not what it's about. And maybe I chose that rude word incorrectly.
Okay.
But I think it was haranguing. She was haranguing her.
Yeah, that's a fair word.
I don't think she was giving her actually any opportunity to articulate her point of view. It was merely confronting her with things that seemed to me to be, quite arguable kind of points, hardly, sort of being paid by, weapons manufacturers or really horrendous stuff that goes on in Europe that someone like Naomi O'Leary does not do any investigation of. I've never read any kind of investigative reporting from her. In fact, most of what she writes falls into the category of journalism, just merely statements by powerful figures in Europe. It's not interesting. It's not investigative journalism, and to classify what she's doing with Claire Daly as investigative journalism is incorrect, I would say.
Okay, but hold on that, and I'm not going to classify it as that. I mean, she's getting open source information, but there isn't a shred of doubt, because we can see it, and you can actually, as well as it being broadcast, clips on YouTube and so forth, and I will link to some of those. But you can see the primetime propaganda channels of Putin aimed within Russia, so aimed at a Russian market, feature herself and Mick Wallace extremely prominently, giving the impression that they are very senior leaders in, for example, Ireland, and using their words and not needing to abuse the words, the words mean what they mean, to indicate that the view that Russia is being victimized by the West and that the war in Ukraine is the fault of NATO and Russia is merely defending itself and ethnic Russians who live in Ukraine. Claire Daly's words are basically on hard rotation within Russia to give the impression that is widespread.
You said that the war is the fault of NATO. Now, when as a history student, we always look at the long and short-term causes of any war, right? And if you look at the Russian-Ukrainian conflict, there's a short-term explanation. Vladimir Putin did something very irrational and wrong, which was he invaded Ukraine, and seemingly in an attempt to conquer much of it. Now, and that backfired, and it may lead to the end of Putin, and I think that would be a good thing for Russia. Okay, but let's look back a little bit further and go back to the 1990s when Russia is in a complete state of meltdown, where between 1991 and 1995, Russian life expectancy dropped by 5 years. So in that period of the 1990s, something like 8,000 mathematicians left the country. It was in absolute decline. Yeltsin comes in. It's still a complete mess. Putin comes in 1999 under very actually quite controversial circumstances. Amid accusations that he bombed, that the Russian Secret Service bombed.
They started a war against Chechnya and bombed various buildings in Russia.
But every embassy in Moscow greeted this with relief that a strong figure was going to come to power in Russia. This is well documented, and we're very content to have the flows of fossil fuel energy coming out of the country. Stable Russia was good for the West, and so on. And the people who around Putin and Putin himself all wanted closer ties to the West. They attempted to join NATO. They sought membership. This is documented when Putin met Clinton in 2000. He wondered about whether an invitation would be extended. There was a bit of a kind of muffled response, and then there was a general decision among the Americans not to allow Russia into NATO. So this created an asymmetry and a problematic relation between Russia and Europe, so this relationship and this it's sort of the conflict has crystallized around Ukraine and competing for this what was the breadbasket of the Soviet Empire and the Tsarist Empire before it, where the gas pipeline is passing through. Where you have so many conflicts of interest between East and West, and this has, the Russian Navy being in Crimea, their only wet water port through the year. There's huge sources of potential for conflict. Now, the West and Europe and America did not do enough to avert that conflict, and you could argue that there were a lot of interests in actually perpetuating that conflict.
Which conflict
so
exactly? Which conflict exactly?
Sorry?
Frank, which conflict exactly?
Which conflicts of interest could there be?
You said there was vested interests that had an interest in perpetuating that conflict. Which conflict exactly?
The conflict between Russia and Ukraine.
There was no conflict between Russia and Ukraine. There was no conflict between Russia and Ukraine to the extent that Ukraine gave up all of the nuclear weapons that were sited on its territory.
Yeah, but there was a conflict in 2014, which I'm sure you're aware of.
In 2014, yes, of course. Yes, but not at the time that Putin came to power.
No.
What strikes me, Frank, is that in the weeks and in fact up to days before the invasion by Putin of Ukraine, both Claire Daly and Mick Wallace, and others as well, seemed to think that they had some special access to Vladimir Putin's inner thoughts and were able to tell us with absolute certainty that Vladimir Putin didn't want a war. They said quite literally that the massing of almost 200,000 troops and vast amount of military hardware on the Ukraine border, they explicitly said that this was clearly defensive. That wasn't a quote that aged very well. And they have made a whole...
They got it wrong. They got it wrong.
No, slow down. They made a whole...
But are you suggesting they're spies?
No, I'm saying that they made a whole slew of comments which suggested that they had special access to know the contents to know the contents of Vladimir Putin's heart and to know that he didn't want a conflict. Now, in fact, if you look at what the Russians are telling themselves, in particular the Russian elite around Putin, and the type of texts that are being taught in the elite academies and the military schools and so forth within Russia, they're absolutely clear. They're entirely clear that they want to destroy Ukraine because for complicated ethnic and religion,
So are you referring to the paper that Putin wrote about a Ukrainian national identity?
I'm going over a quarter of a century. I'm starting with the works of Alexander Dugin, and most recently, most recently, an article published on RIA, which is the Russian government news service, which explicitly said they wanted to kill every single member of what they call the Ukrainian elite and the Ukrainian army, and to subject the remaining surviving Ukrainians to 25 years of re-education. And by the way, that's only the first country on their list that they wish to conquer, including pretty much all of the former Soviet states, plus Finland and Mongolia, and they're very clear that they want to destroy democracy.
No, William, we can agree that Vladimir Putin has imperialist ambitions.
Yes.
There's no doubt about that. This isn't about justifying Vladimir Putin.
Mm-hmm.
Of course, much of what he's done is reprehensible. But the point is that the West has had a role in that orientation of Putin's policy.
How?
Well, because if you look back in the early days of the 2000s, there was a chance, a fleeting opportunity for Russia to be accommodated within Europe, and for some kind of, they called it Partnership for Peace, some kind of organization that would manage relations. You know, there are understandable. Like, let's not ignore also that there are understandable grievances among the Russian government elites,
such as
don't say
understand. Say what it is.
Such as the treatment of ethnic Russians, not just in Ukraine but in other countries too.
For example, I'm going to tie it down to this: the treatment of ethnic Russians. Has there been a single example of how some systemic discrimination?
Human Rights Watch have cited numerous examples of, for example, Russian language publications were banned in Ukraine.
That's nonsense. More than half. No, hold on for a second. More than half of Ukrainians speak Russian as a native language. The issue of Frank, I'm not going to run past this. The situation with the Ukrainian language in Ukraine is not that different from that of the Irish language in Ireland. A greater proportion of Ukrainians would speak Ukrainian as a native language, and now fewer and fewer Ukrainians speak Russian, not because they don't speak it, but because they're hating it. But it's difficult because it is, of course, politically charged. It's difficult to say what the exact proportion is, and it's certain that more Ukrainians, a bigger proportion of Ukrainians speak Ukrainian as a native language and as an everyday language than Irish people speak Irish. But it's not that dissimilar a situation. The Russian language, and to give listeners a clear idea, Vladimir Zelensky doesn't speak Ukrainian. The notion that people who speak Russian,
it's very surprising that they would ban all Russian language.
But it's nonsense. That has never happened.
Well, look it up, William.
Just look it up. You're sounding like an anti-vaxxer. Hang on a second.
If you look on Human Rights Watch, also you'll find that there were abuses. There were abuses committed against ethnic Russians in the East.
Mm-hmm.
You'll find that Russian speakers, monolingual Russian speakers, were not allowed to be employed in the Ukrainian civil service.
Yes, and I want to stick to the facts on this. Frank, I want to deal with the facts on this.
Why can't you see that there are two sides to every argument? This is the problem. This is the problem we have in the world now. We're not capable of recognizing that our opponent may have something valuable to say, that we actually may learn from something. We may learn from constructive dialogue, constructive disputes.
I absolutely agree. I absolutely agree. But Frank, we need to be very clear in listening to other people's opinions and so forth, and there's a distinction between that and giving credibility to nonsensical falsehoods. Now, first of all...
Sorry, am I giving credibility to nonsensical falsehoods, or is it Claire Daly?
Claire Daly, yes. I'm not accusing you. How
did she give credibility to a nonsensical falsehood?
For example, going on Iranian TV and lauding a force called the Popular Mobilization Force. I think it is.
Okay, do you know anything about them?
It's an Islamic fundamentalist organization.
Okay. Have you done anything more than actually look at their Wikipedia page?
I'm sure you're going to tell me stuff, so go ahead.
Well, I haven't done much more, but they're a non-sectarian group, which and like, Naomi O'Leary is saying that they aren't, they don't approve of same-sex marriage or whatever it is. Now, I don't think you would find any group in Iraq, any political party that would approve of same-sex marriage. It was a completely ridiculous point to level against them or against Claire Daly. I don't know enough about that group. They may well be. What I was impressed by that they were non-sectarian, which is very important in an Iraqi context, as I'm sure you know, where there's such a long history of dispute between the Shia and Sunni.
Yeah. Yes, and I'm not disputing that, but what I'm saying is that Claire Daly has allowed herself to be used as essentially a puppet, and I mean that in its precise sense, that she is parroting the message that very, very reprehensible people in autocratic regimes want to have presented, and she is allowing herself to be used for that, and for two different audiences. Number one, for a Western audience to present hideously autocratic governments as in some way legitimate, and for their own internal audiences to present to them a false narrative that those autocratic governments, the positions of those autocratic governments have significant support in the West.
Claire Daly said Russia is 100% responsible for invading Ukraine.
Complete the quote.
Oh, well, that's all I have. That's what I have in front of me.
Let me tell you, because what she said, and you're correct, and that's a reasonable thing to point out.
100% responsible. I think that's fairly clear.
She said, it is, but complete the quote, because what she said, and she kind of had to say that Russia and Putin are responsible for the invasion. She then argues,
we cannot ignore the part played by the EU and the US. I agree with her.
Yes. And that's a reasonable thing to say as well. It's
simply to explain, because you solve a problem if you don't solve a problem if you don't understand the root of it. I agree.
Okay, but then her solution, and you're correct, she is saying two things that are actually hard to disagree with, and then she presents a solution, and she has two things that she is promoting. Number one, she's saying that all sanctions against...
Are you going to quote her?
Yes,
I am.
Yes.
Okay.
She's saying all sanctions against Russia should be removed, number one. And number two, that an arms embargo should be placed on Ukraine. So, I have to say, I don't really think that...
I don't see her. Are these sanctions aimed at the civilian population?
She has said that all sanctions against Russia should be removed.
In that speech, I don't see her.
I will get the quote precisely if you want that. But her position is that all sanctions against Russia should be removed.
Let's go back to Iraq again.
Frank, this is.
We can go back to Iraq.
We can because I'm going to say on this point. Frank, I'm going to say on this point for one moment. Those two things that she is arguing for are precisely the position of the Russian government, because that would precisely be the two things that would help Vladimir Putin most.
Okay, so if I say anything that aligns with the interests of the Russian government, then I'm some kind of spy or somebody who's being
Frank, no. But if
€1,000 in a brown paper envelope.
No, Frank. But if everything you advocate aligns with the position of the Russian government,
no, that's not true, because we've just established that she regards Russia as 100% responsible. So she's not.
Yeah.
Everything she advocates and says is not pro-Russian.
And the solution that she presents, but the solution she then presents is 100% aligned.
No, that's only part of a wider solution. I'm quite sure of that. That she wants a long-term peace treaty. She wants
as
a resolution to the varied and vexed issues that the region confronts.
And the way that she wants it achieved is she wants all sanctions removed from Russia and an arms embargo placed on Ukraine. And
okay, so let's
take
deal
a
with
genius. It doesn't take a genius to work out.
Can we deal with those arguments?
Yeah, go ahead.
Can we deal with those arguments?
Sure.
Okay, sanctions. Now, sanctions are problematic, as we've seen in Iraq, because they tend to hurt the population and actually reinforce the power of the elite government, and those around the what usually becomes a dictatorship.
Is that what happened in South Africa?
No, it's what happened in Iraq.
Would you have been?
Which is a very recent experience of where Saddam Hussein had numerous sanctions imposed against him, and it did nothing to remove the Ba'ath from power in Iraq, and actually made them more radical and arguably more vindictive than might have otherwise been the case.
Okay, so that's your case against sanctions on Russia. What's your case for an arms embargo on Ukraine?
Well, I'm not sure about that. Personally, I'm very. I want to see the war ending as soon as possible.
Yeah, well, if Ukraine was,
if we just pump billions and billions of dollars worth of American weaponry into Ukraine, that will actually happen.
Okay, Frank, I want you to clarify. Frank, I want you to clarify.
Weaponized as part of a proxy war that the United States is keen to have with Russia in order to bloody its nose, and perhaps, who knows, to bring in a gas pipeline into Europe. Which I'm sure you're well aware of.
Well, there's gas
the
pipeline
LNG
there.
terminal.
Yeah, gas pipe. Well, I think you're referring to the Irish one. But just hold on for a second, because I want to clarify something you said. You said you want the war to end as quickly as possible. Is that the only criteria?
No, it's not the only criteria.
Okay, but as quickly as possible. So clearly, one way that the war would end as clearly as possible would be what Vladimir Putin has demanded, that the Ukrainians surrender.
Well, I'm not advocating that.
Okay, but you said you wanted to end as quickly as possible. That would mean the war would be over instantly.
I would like to see real statesmen in Europe, or stateswomen, actually try to get the parties to agree a settlement, to agree, whether it's rights for minority rights, whether it may involve ceding the Crimea. I think that, you probably are familiar with the history of Crimea and how it only became part of Ukraine in the 1950s.
Yeah, about 100 years after it became part of Russia. Yeah.
Minority. What's that?
After about 50 years after it became part of Russia, it was originally populated by Crimean Tatars.
I'm aware of that. Terrible things happened there under Stalin.
Yeah,
sure.
But hold on for a second.
Hold on for a second, Frank. That Russian minority that Russian population that's there be actually removed from there now.
No, but they lived there for a quarter of a century, entirely free to speak their own language. Crimea wasn't, unlike most of Ukraine, Crimea was an entirely Russian-speaking area of Ukraine.
Yeah.
The Russian had a special status in Ukraine.
They wouldn't be allowed to get a job in the Ukrainian civil service or print a Russian language magazine.
Well, hold on for a second. Until very recently, there were Irish language requirements on all sorts of things. You couldn't be a barrister in Ireland up to a few years ago without passing an Irish language exam.
Okay, do you want to go off Gaeilge now because we're in Ireland?
No, I'm saying that
the national language once again. Come on, nationalism, as we know, is a very destructive force. Whether it's Ukrainian or Russian, or even this sort of strange European nationalism that's emerging under the current president of the Commission.
Okay, Frank, let me take a left turn there. Let me take a turn then in the argument, because one thing that I think is here, and by the way, I actually think, for all my criticism, I actually think that probably Claire Daly and Mick Wallace are relatively decent people in a lot of ways. And I'm not accusing them, although I think it may have happened in other cases, I'm not accusing them of taking brown envelopes from somebody with a trench coat who came from the Russian embassy or anything like that. I think they've been misguided to a very significant degree, but I'm not accusing them of being bad people.
That's absolutely fair enough.
Yeah,
fair. We can have disagreements.
Allow me to explain that a bit further. And I think that one thing, particularly with maybe a set generation of Irish people on the left, that America was the bad guy. America was the force to be protesting against. If you went outside the GPO on any given Saturday when there was a demonstration, you could be fairly sure that the Americans were the entity being protested against in one form or another. But the thing is, Frank, two things can be true at once. And it can be true that, we can be critical of American foreign policy, we can be critical of the poor level of democracy within the United States, we can be critical of the level of media diversity and therefore freedom of speech within the United States. And the fact that you make similar criticisms of a dictatorship like Russia doesn't mean that there is any equivalence. And
there's no equivalence between who?
Between
US foreign policy and Russian foreign policy? There is. I can say that explicitly.
Okay, no, I'm not specifically talking about foreign policy.
You're saying that...
Okay,
what are you saying?
Allow me to finish. What I'm saying is that the whataboutery that is used almost to excuse some terrible things around the world can at times be
that term itself is extremely problematic. Whataboutery. That allows our mainstream media to set the debate completely. For example, all we get is reports on Russia. We don't get reports on Mexico or Congo or Syria or Afghanistan. We only get one thing put in front of us by our mainstream media, and we're told that this is the only thing you're allowed to discuss now. And we're not allowed to discuss US drone strikes or Modi's policies in India.
Okay, pause. I take your
really.
point. Okay, hold on for a second. I take your point on that. I want you just to listen to a piece of audio from the local election count in 2014. And that's I think, People Before Profit supporters in full voice telling Owen Murphy, who was then the housing minister, what they thought of the policy of building co-living units.
I didn't hear the word. I didn't hear what they were saying, actually.
They were saying, shove your co-living up your arse.
Okay.
My point is that they were literally within touching distance. They were 3 or 4 meters, a few Gardaí around, but they were within 3 or 4 meters of a senior cabinet minister. And I absolutely agree that there are failings in Irish society, there are failings in Irish bureaucracy, there are failings in democracy in Ireland. But the reaction of when people point out appalling behaviour by autocrats in different countries to say, sure, we're just as bad ourselves because RTE isn't as balanced as it should be.
I didn't say that.
No, I'm not accusing you of that. I'm not accusing you of that. But the point being, that is enormously disproportionate, and there are frequently
but this is just a straw man you're dealing with. William, you're dealing with a straw man. You've created a straw man. You need to. If you're going to say something like that, you actually have to, have a good example, not people shouting at Owen Murphy at council.
Okay, no, but to put that in context, we have had recent few weeks, people in Russia being arrested, and it is not known what their fate were, for doing things as simple as holding up a blank piece of paper and standing on a street in the middle of Moscow. They're members of Pussy Riot, the feminist punk band in Moscow, have been unbelievably brave. Yeah. And
William, I agree. This is all reprehensible. I wrote about this in 2015 in an article for Village magazine. I can send it on to you.
Okay, my point is, hold on a second. My point is, it's absolutely fine. I've no problem with criticising, for example, balance on RTE, but surely we should have some sense of proportion to understand that we across space and time are incredibly lucky to live in a very highly democratic and rich society.
That's an interesting point. Okay, I think that's, you're absolutely right that for expressing views that I have done over the years, I would be put in a prison cell and beaten up in many countries. Okay,
you'd be lucky to survive in many countries.
I very much understand that,
Mm-hmm.
but we're also in an era of social media which is controlling people's opinions in very, very subtle ways that we don't understand fully, and that were revealed through, for example, Cambridge Analytica, and which we're slowly becoming aware of. But actually, I don't think we're quite aware to the extent to which our opinions are actually informed by social media, and also by mainstream media. I'm sure you're familiar with Noam Chomsky and his idea of manufacturing consent and the kind of viewpoints that we are given, the stuff that's ignored. This is, our democracies are managed and have been for decades, hundreds of years.
I want to answer you on that.
Oscar Wilde observed it at the end of the 19th century.
Oh, okay, hold on for a second. Frank, I totally agree, and I absolutely agree that there are problems with that. But I just want to refer you to the Economist Intelligence Unit's, what they call the Democracy Index. And what they do is they have a list of questions, there's several hundred questions that they apply to every country in the world. And it's basically to assess the quality of the democracy in those countries. And we lose sight, I think, of the fact that Ireland scores incredibly highly, to the point that the countries above us, there's 6 countries above us on the list. They're mostly fairly small than the ones you expect, the Nordic countries and New Zealand. 1/3 of 1% of the population of this planet lives in a better quality democracy than Ireland. So I don't moment...
Wait a second.
Yeah.
That you're talking about one particular unit that is measuring, or one organization that is measuring democracy.
Yeah.
I think a more granular analysis of Irish democracy would reveal it's actually not in such great shape.
Well, first of all, there are dozens and dozens of questions applied. They're generally unarguable. It's not, it's highly falsifiable information. It's not something that is open to motivated interpretation. And they're just ranking the world, the countries of the world. They're not saying that everybody's above average. But while I completely agree that isn't for one moment a reason to do everything we can to further improve that, surely when we're looking around the world, we should have cognizance of the fact that whatever our flaws, we are very, very lucky to be in such a highly democratic country as we are.
Okay, I think that's an arguable proposition.
Why is it arguable?
I think it's a little... Sorry?
Why is it arguable?
That Ireland has good democratic structures. I think we've got a reasonably good, actually quite a good constitution, which separates powers, but a good separation of power. But we actually have really, really quite a lot. I think it's going in a bad direction, Irish democracy. I think local democracy is very, very lacking. In terms of, for example, how many years has the idea of an elected mayor been discussed? To what extent? That's what in Dublin. To what extent are the civil service exercise or permanent government exercising disproportionate powers and appropriating powers from elected politicians, as we saw during the pandemic, when there was a gross takeover of power by unelected civil servants? So I would say that the trend is downwards. I think there's a significant lack of media diversity there are basically 2 newspaper organizations in the country. We don't have a thriving press. I would say we've very, very few alternative publications available. Now, we maybe don't have the critical mass to have very many periodicals, but their decline, the number seems to be declining every year. I think our education system is very, very poor. particularly at secondary level, but also at third level in the humanities. And I think that the OECD have given advice to the effect that we need to do more than to be educating second-class robots. Mm-hmm. To quote the person who wrote the report. So I think we're heading in the wrong direction. I think we often lose sight of inequalities, which economic inequalities, which actually make democracy very difficult for so you might have a superficially good democracy, but when for example 17% of the population is functionally illiterate, then you have a problem with in your democracy. When for example, what proportion of society was born outside Ireland, and therefore don't have votes, cannot vote in Irish elections. So that means that there's a huge problem with the countryside being disproportionately represented than cities where most migrants live. So I think that's not
correct. No, that you're not correct on the last point, because the TDs are allocated per population. So in fact, it means that Irish citizens who live in areas that are highly populated by non-citizens, their vote actually counts for more. But to address the whole list of issues that you said there, I agree with you on every point, every single one. My only quibble is that while going after every single one of those, we shouldn't lose sight of the fact that other countries have it far, far worse, and that it is nonsensical to say that when you complain, for example, about the mildest of criticisms from a Russian journalist getting her fired or thrown in prison is in some way comparable to the issues that you have raised about Ireland. That doesn't mean that those issues are irrelevant.
We're kind of getting into two different conversations here.
Yeah, that's my point. There are two different conversations, and neither negates the other. And the fact that Ireland and Irish people are phenomenally lucky to live in a time and a place where we are incredibly rich and incredibly
No. Wait a second. That's not true. You're saying we're phenomenally lucky because of our democracy. Look at the social contract is breaking down in this country because of profound inequalities, particularly in housing. Mm-hmm. And you can have an optimal democratic system. Mm-hmm. You can have adequate separation of powers. You can have a very bespoke democracy. But when people under the age of 40 are obliged to live with their parents or emigrate, then you're into a kind of social breakdown. And when a government permits homelessness to persist at an unacceptable level, you really wonder what kind of society we're heading towards, and all the embedded poverty in this country that expresses itself in health inequalities and educational inequalities, that governments are just failing,
pause.
Like the idea that like I'm not a communist. I don't want the state to control all the means of production, but I want a government that actually provides decent services. Mm-hmm. And isn't corrupted by private interests, which, as far as I can see, for the last number of, maybe since the inception of the state, it has been.
Yeah, Frank, I agree with you that all of those things should happen. But what I'm trying to get is a balanced view that recognizes that try as we should to solve all of those problems, we shouldn't lose sight of the fact that people in other countries are suffering vastly more, and people in previous generations suffered vastly more and suffered vastly more privations than we do.
Yeah, well, I think
there's a second point.
There's a second
point to that thought. There's a second part of that thought, because the second part of that thought is that the focus that we have on trying to fix those problems and complaining about them as we should and trying to fix them as we shouldn't lead to the cognitive failure that makes us imagine that vastly greater problems exist in other countries, primarily autocratic countries, and we shouldn't imagine that we're suffering at anything like the same level.
I'm not suffering like anything
we,
like
as
the
a
same
country,
level personally.
people who are homeless are suffering.
But I'm aware that there are people who are in situations of, where they are suffering, and it's not good enough just to say that we have a functioning democracy.
No, I'm not saying it's not good enough. I'm not saying we shouldn't try to improve. I'm saying that in trying to improve, we shouldn't lose sight of the fact that Ireland as a whole is doing vastly better than anywhere has in previous centuries, and most other countries are doing around the world currently.
Well, I mean, there are other indicators, for example, levels of depression, levels of obesity, which we're not doing better on. I mean, 2003, the New England Journal of Medicine brought out a paper saying that actually we've reached a point where life expectancy in America is decreasing, and we follow a lot of American norms.
Yeah, that's true.
And I think Irish health is deteriorating.
Yeah, I'm not arguing any of that.
Was symptomatic of that.
No, what really irks me is, because this is where it comes up, and I will get the precise quote and I'll cut it in if I can, but it is a commonly expressed feeling that if any criticism is made of autocratic dictatorships, for example, Cuba, for example, Russia, there is a line that comes back which says, sure, aren't we worse ourselves? We're not. We are not even remotely in the same league.
Again, William, I didn't say this.
No, but Claire Daly does.
So you're saying that I have to defend people.
No, but Claire Daly does.
I'm not aligned with any political party.
Would you acknowledge that? Okay.
I've had major differences with members of the left in recent times.
Okay, Frank. Allow me then to ask you. Number one, would you agree that response is out there quite often, number one, and number two, it's rubbish?
I'm not sure I would actually agree that it's out there that often.
Seriously,
and I would agree that when you cannot compare, an autocratic system such as Vladimir Putin's to our own. But there are, I mean, in Eastern Europe, you're seeing a breakdown of the rule of law as well. It's not,
for example,
there are other countries in Eastern Europe, including Poland, where the rule of law is breaking down.
Yeah,
where journalists are being arrested.
Yeah,
and being
Hungary in particular.
So it's they're like, I don't think we're being given a very full picture in our media currently. I think we can agree on that.
I think we can agree that there's a lot of problems with Irish media. Hopefully people will have other sources, possibly this podcast, to get other voices to hear. Frank Armstrong, editor of Cassandra Voices magazine, thank you very much for talking to me.
Thank you very much for the conversation, William.
If you like the Here's How podcast, please rate and review the show on iTunes and other podcast providers. Share it on Facebook and Twitter, but most of all, tell your friends.
Go to the website for sources and references from the show. And while you're there, you can like the show on Facebook, follow the show on Twitter at Here's How Podcast, and follow Frank Armstrong at Frank Armstrong 2. And get in touch if you can suggest a guest or a topic for the next show. And thanks again to Tom and Graham and Peter and all of the other patrons on Patreon. As I said, we don't get anything like what some other Irish podcasters that I could mention get, but it pays for things like web hosting and some other costs. We basically do the podcast for free from our own time. But if you could do the same as the current patrons and donate the cover price of an Irish Times once or twice a month, please do go and sign up at patreon.com/here'show. That link is on the website, and there you can find out how to subscribe to the podcast for free on your computer, on your phone, or by email. All of that information is at www.here'show.ie. On the next podcast, I'll be talking to Ellie O'Byrne of Cork's local news Substack, Tripe and Drisheen. That'll be up on Thursday, the 23rd of June. The Here's How podcast is produced and presented by me, William Campbell. The assistant producer is Kevin Wolf. Thank you for listening.